Hello, welcome to another Geotech Hour. I'm your host, Dr. David Bray, inaugural director of the Atlantic Council's Geotech Center, and we have a very exciting conversation assembled today to talk about synthetic data, privacy, and the future of trust. Now, this conversation builds off a partnership that we've had over the last year with our partners at Accenture, where we did a series of 6 data salons. The 6 data salons focused on bringing together peers in terms of data science, those who were interested in actually applying it to make the world better, and thinking about the ethics of data as we work together. You can find those videos. We've now actually posted them online. And this conversation is to carry it forward as we address the conversation of synthetic data and how it can be used to address questions about privacy and enhancing the future of trust. And to join us as one of the first panelists, I'd like to actually welcome one of our panelists, who is Stephen, who actually, with Accenture, helped us do today's salon. So Stephen, if I could ask you real quick, introduce yourself, and then two, maybe sort of, could you tell us, well, what is synthetic data, and how can it actually help us address questions about privacy and trust?
Thank you, David. Hi, I'm Stephen Teal. I lead responsible innovation at Accenture, and I'm also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Geotech Center. Maybe if I could take your question and backwards, or the last part first. You know, the two things that we really see as drivers for synthetic data, I'll look at both industry and kind of a regulatory side of things, if you will. So the first is we see strong demand in banking. This is for things such as anti-fraud, anti-money laundering, interbank collaborations, improving equitable access to capital, things like that. We also see strong interest in healthcare, and this is really around the ability to share data, ability to do deep insights. And then the regulatory side of things, you know, we're seeing that a changing landscape of privacy policy around the world is causing a lot of organizations to look for, you know, how do I really go beyond? How do I have this not be an impediment to my business, but maybe a strategic enabler for you know, my business being able to carry on where there might be barriers to entry for others. And synthetic data can provide that by really, you know, kind of sidestepping a lot of the privacy concerns, because there is no personal information or personally identifiable information, you know, within that synthetic data set. And then on the trust side, you know, how synthetic data helps to build trust is that, you know, one, it's privacy preserving. There is no information about individuals that is contained within those synthetic data sets. It also allows for things like statistical testing of fairness, for data sharing, as I said before, without private information being exchanged, and some other benefits as well. So there's a lot of, you know, compelling reasons to look at it, and particularly so in specific industries.
Excellent, and I appreciate that, really sort of illustrating why it's important and how it matters. And maybe real quick, if I could ask you a real quick rejoinder, Stephen. So if we look at it, that synthetic data is really, again, as you said, it doesn't have any personal identifiable information, but it's still actionable and useful. What are you seeing in terms of drivers in the marketplace that actually sort of, you know, you mentioned some what you're seeing in banking and things like that, but are there other drivers that you're seeing that's creating demand signals here?
Yeah, I think too that, you know, without the regulatory side, without the specific industries, what we see is that a lot of, you know, people, specifically younger people who have joined organizations in the last few years, are really holding their employers to a higher standard. They're saying, you know, there's technology out there. Yes, it is kind of cutting edge, but there are ways that we can do things better. And synthetic data is simply, you know, one of the tools in the toolbox of doing things better.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Stephen, for everything that you do as a positive change agent with data. And I look forward to diving deeper with you as we talk about this with the other panelists. And that's a good segue now to Stuart. Stuart, real quick, if you can introduce yourself. And you've written a book in which you talk about synthetic data as being the perfect privacy storm. Could you tell us a little bit more about, once you introduce yourself, about that book and why you think it's really the perfect storm when it comes to privacy?
Sure, thanks, David. So last year I served as a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. And I had the privilege to spend the entire year doing a deep dive into digital privacy policy and all of its ramifications. So the perfect storm is really a metaphor, if you will, for all of the different forces that are now coalescing in terms of the policy community and thinking about digital privacy. So beginning in 2018, the European Union enacted the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the umbrella privacy regulation that's now being implemented by the individual states of the EU. And now that we have Brexit, the UK will be undergoing a comparable process of enforcement, even though it's not technically part of the GDPR. Then in 2019, California enacted the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, and that was probably the broadest federal or statewide act in the United States. In part, it looks a bit like the GDPR, but it has a number of other elements in it. And that began a momentum of states. So we now have 20 states which are considering or have enacted digital privacy laws. Most recently, we have the state of Maine enacting. There's a privacy bill on the desk of the governor of Virginia, which is expected to be signed very soon. And most critically, some of our largest states, including New York, Texas, Florida, Illinois, and Pennsylvania, have initiated some legislative activities in the area. So what we see is a lot of activity at the state level, and of course that leaves the federal level. So in the 116th Congress, which was the most recent Congress, there were 4 pieces of legislation that were introduced in this area. Very interestingly, introduced by Republicans and Democrats, but there's no bipartisan consensus, and so we have separate bills from the individual parties. We also have 2 legislative drafts. And of course, since March of last year, we have COVID-19, which really, I think, underscores the intensity of data use. Obviously, we're all working at home and living our lives at home as well. And so we have more people now who are sending and storing and transmitting personal information. And so really we have a sort of a tsunami of information which continues to well up. So where does that put synthetic data? So as I've illustrated here, most of the policy discussion has been in the area of legislation and regulation. And I think synthetic data has the possibility to broaden this conversation, not just in terms of what I call a stick approach, but also to a carrot approach, to the idea that the private sector, or maybe the private sector in conjunction with the public sector, can come up with solutions which obviously are going to be very privacy protective and consistent with all of these legislative goals, yet they may not involve this carrot or this stick of regulation and further enforcement. So that's the relationship between synthetic data and digital privacy policy. And I think one of the things that needs to be done is there needs to be a greater discussion now between the privacy policy community and the people who are involved in synthetic data, because my perception is that the policy community doesn't quite understand all of the technical and other ramifications of synthetic data, but I'm very positive about it.
That's very good framing of what we face here in the United States. And I really liked how, Stuart, you were saying that, again, that this could actually be a carrot as opposed to a stick. And actually, if the private sector seized on it, it's better to shape the future as opposed to have the future forced upon you. So maybe if I could ask you real quick, if you were to try and make a very short pitch to a CEO as to why they should actually embrace synthetic data now, as opposed to waiting to see what's done to you in terms of legislation, if you had a real quick short elevator pitch, what would be your pitch to a private sector CEO as to why they should embrace it now?
Well, we see that, first of all, it works. And so that's a very positive concept, that you're not really doing things experimentally. And second, of course, we see that there are interesting developments around the world. For example, in Australia, we have a great pilot project now with MasterCard, Australia Post, and Deakin University to pilot elements of synthetic data. So what's interesting is you can not only talk about this technically in theory, but you can begin to talk about pilots. And from the CEO perspective, I think one thing that could be done quite soon is to begin to initiate pilot projects in the area.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate you highlighting it. It was a really good pitch, Stuart, and hopefully some folks are listening and will be listening to this because we'd like to obviously help bring the future forward and actually have it be things where people are leading by the carrot model. So I appreciate that, Stuart. That's a good segue now to our friends up in the north with Krista, longtime friend of the Geotech Center, also a senior fellow with us. And I know Canada, as I understand right now, is looking at privacy and reshaping privacy. So maybe if you could real quick share for our audience what's happening there and where you see possible opportunities as Canada thinks about reshaping privacy, identity management, and synthetic data as well, Krista.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. So as you mentioned, we are currently undergoing a review of our Privacy Act in Canada. And I loved hearing Stuart talk about GDPR and the work that's happening around the world, because so much of that actually started in Canada with Anne Cavoukian, who's been recognized as kind of the godmother of privacy by design. So much of her framework is what first started here in Canada and then was taken into GDPR and around the world. And so we've really had this idea of that privacy-centric model at the core of so much of our innovation here. And I get really excited when we start talking about synthetic data, because where we're really seeing innovation happening is in the healthcare sector. And we know from research that we've done that this is a space where people are very protective of their personal data for obvious reasons, but where there's a huge potential in the synthetic data to help move and advance research, especially in things like rare diseases. So actually just back in October, we had a major piece of research that came out with Health City and the Institute for Health Economics out in Alberta, where they're doing some major data sets around synthetic data. And I'm personally really excited about a project that's been funded through a national program called our superclusters. We've got a digital supercluster, and there's a project in there called TrustSphere. And this is a partnership, to your point, on public, private, and nonprofit. This is between the BC Children's Hospital, SecureKey, and Identos, looking at type 1 diabetes and starting to create data trust there and approaching this idea of data donors. And if we take that idea of data donors and then extrapolate that into synthetic data, we start to get to this idea of what could we do that is privacy enhancing, that enables us to do research into highly vulnerable populations. Here we're talking about kids and illness. So it's something that we haven't traditionally wanted to touch at scale, and nobody wants to hold that data set because of the liability. Then we're starting to get into some really exciting potential around these use cases. So while, like Stephen, I love the financial services application, I get really excited about the healthcare implications and where this can go. I have a little girl who lives up the street from me who has SMA, an extremely rare disease with populations around the world. And the treatment for this is a vaccine that is several millions of dollars. And it is heartbreaking to see parents trying to fundraise for that. And that's where synthetic data could come in. If we could start to create these data sets that are anonymized around the world and reduce the cost of research, we could be leveraging these tools to make a massive impact on the healthcare center. So those are the places that I get really excited about. And I'm seeing our privacy legislation align to start to understand that privacy can actually be an enabler of innovation. I think synthetic data is one of those examples rather than a barrier. And to those who are listening, I'd say, how might you think about privacy as that enabler of innovation as opposed to the barrier?
Excellent. Well, very well said, Chris. And then you're absolutely, I mean, I'm similarly like you, is that we, even though nobody wants to necessarily touch the data of this is the sensitivity level of children, if we don't address this, and maybe synthetic data obviously clearly is a way that we can do it to actually make it safer, we're not going to be able to actually bring down the cost of researching cures and making these cures affordable. So that's very well framed as a value proposition. So maybe for our audience that, I know you and I have had conversations in the past about data trust and data co-ops, but for our audience that may not know about it, real quick, could you maybe share what a data trust or data co-op is and how synthetic data might actually be formed as a part of a data co-op or data trust?
Absolutely. So a data trust is where you have large groups of individuals who are effectively becoming data donors. So you're contributing your data into a data set for researchers to use, or in fact, contain that data trust. So for these youth whose parents made data, then we can take out that known identity, those personal identifiers, and create basically a lookalike data set that research longer use case.
Only truly people's private health records and things.
Well, it's both. I think, David, it's both that. It doesn't have the tripwires of personal data, interesting balance there that tends to give us.
So friend of the Geotech, making the time zone jump to join us for the live show here today. And two, what are...
Hi, thanks, David, and thanks to the Geotech Center. So I'm a lawyer by background, and a lot of my work in recent years has really been advising African governments on various technology-related laws. And so I guess something that I am seeing across the continent is a lot more countries thinking deeper about privacy, about cybersecurity and the like, in part just because, proliferation of the internet, in part really trying to start thinking forward about how to set up locations to attract investment in technology. So we see Silicon Savannah in Kenya, but also here in South Africa and Nigeria, very strong potential hubs to attract investment. Now, from a regulatory reform perspective, at the moment, there are about 17 out of 55 countries that have privacy laws. So, still a long way to go. But all that to say, there is work in motion. I think what we're trying to work on, not only as far as not only getting the laws in place, but also making sure that there is this balance between government trying to regulate, but also making sure that the environment doesn't stifle innovation. And so that's something that we've been working really hard on to say it's okay to legislate, but make sure, we can attract investment and people here can really innovate for good. On the synthetic data aspect, unfortunately, not too many use services perspective, financial health are huge topics, not only from a about how we can use synthetic data, some of the, even as we're dealing parts of the world, so forensic ability here. And I think that idea of, of kind of cross-continental compliance, I think is one that really has a lot of us, legal.
Well said, Jacqueline, and not to put you on a spot, but if you were to recommend, whether it be financial inclusion or what might be...
decide to engage with their populations online by choice or by force, through the use of social media, what we're starting to see is kind of more engagement. And so I think it would be important to really have a conversation about peace and security, democracy as it relates to kind of where we are at this point, but also the role of technology in engaging people, especially young people. I mean, a majority of the continent is under the age of 35. By 2050, by 2050, over half of the continent will be under the age of 25. So scary statistics about the youth bulge, and the youth are online and the youth are engaging with one another. It's about time that we used technology and governments and kind of put everyone in the same conversation to make sure that all of our expectations are managed, but also government really starts to figure out how to best deliver to citizens.
Very well said, and I was inspired by what you said, that we used to think democracy was just about exercising your vote, but in fact what we may be realizing is, especially in an era in which we're now interconnected and we're producing data, but we're also using technology, there's a lot of rethinking about what that entails too. So very well said, Jacqueline, and that's a good segue. And by the way, I would remind our audience, please ask your questions, both if you're watching on live stream, please send your questions either through the Zoom chat, if you're on the Zoom chat, or via social media through our Twitter account at AC Geotech. And that builds up to our last panelist, but definitely one that we want to hear from. So Mike Capps, if you could real quick share both who you are and what is DivePlane, and then two, give us your thoughts about, again, we've talked a little bit about why CEOs should care, but maybe even more, your thoughts about why CEOs should be excited about synthetic data.
Sure. Hi, folks. I'm Mike Capps. I'm a reformed video game developer, built games like Fortnite and the like, and decided to do something a little bit more productive. So focusing on explainable AI and synthetic data. So we're the folks building this sort of technology. And Krista, call me afterwards. I would be delighted to help you build a synthetic data lake for your problems. It's exactly what needs to be done. And the price is free for what you're working on. So when you talk about CEOs and why they should care, I mean, this is the pitch I have to make all the time, right? It's great to say, let's preserve privacy, but that's cool. But if nobody's regulating me, what's the carrot? If there's not a stick yet, and by God, keep working on the sticks, team. But until that happens, so one is internal use. Just talking to a finance company who's facing fraud in Germany, and fraud in France, but can't work between those two anti-fraud teams because of regulations between just moving data between those two organizations within the same company. So being able to move synthetic data across that barrier is really useful. And for sure, it's the same between the New York and the Singapore office or whatever else. And just the simplicity, it's like in the military, if you could work with unclassified data, you want to, because it just makes your life easier. You don't have to scan your eyeball before you go touch this stuff. And then sort of next step is moving to external friendlies. Imagine you've got a great contractor who can help you solve this problem in an instant, but you're a healthcare organization in the United States. So you just need them to go through a year-long BAA process before they can see it. What if you just hand them some data that has no risk of privacy leak, toss it on your website? In fact, all comers, anyone who wants to download it and try to solve our problem, we will pay you on the other end. That's totally feasible right now. And I would say external sales is next. When you talk about the $1 million shot for SMA, one of the ways we can make pharma more effective and ideally less expensive or move money into healthcare is to have a hospital be able to monetize their data set without any risk of privacy when they sell their, say, imagine St. Jude Children's Hospital could sell their child research data to a pharmacy company or just give it away if that's what they wanted to do, depending on their mission or their financial needs. Pretty cool stuff. The stick is theoretical, but it's coming fast, which is, we all hear the stories about re-identification. You know, oh, there's no way we scratched off every serial number, social security number, address, phone number from this data set, but it happened to include the check-in and check-out time at the hospital, which can be re-identified if you match it up to phone records. Oops, we just leaked tons of personal data. We never could have foreseen this, except anyone could have foreseen that. And the question of liability in that case, when we're all punditing about it right now, it's gonna be hard for a CEO to say, we never could have foreseen that when we put that data out there, that there was a privacy risk. So I think the stick is coming. So there you go.
Very well said. So I guess I have a two-part question, Mike. Is first, tell me a little bit about your journey. I mean, how did you get here from video games to this? I think the audience would like to hear a little bit more about that. And then two, you know, what sort of demonstration projects are you doing or could we do that could actually get the attention of state legislatures, national governments, and things like that, so they buy into this?
Got it. Okay, so video game journey. Well, it's great to make a lot of money in video games first before you decide to go into solving important problems for the world. But you know, honestly, my experience with AI was fairly limited in video game space. My background is in computer graphics, and so when we develop AI, if a monster is running away from you, it could be because there's a bug, because it's afraid of the player, because it's regrouping with its friends to come back at you aggressively. And how do you know what's going on? Well, we'd have it tell us. It'd be very transparent, big flag over its head of what it's doing. And then as I got into what's really going on in AI in the world, it's the exact opposite of that, where nobody has any idea whether that system is shallowly learning or buggy or amazing. And that scared the bejesus out of me. And so really that's the start, was getting into explainable machine learning, building technology that's fully transparent. Well, one of the neat things, we've built this cool platform, which some other day we'll talk about. One of the neat things about it is it's really good at encapsulating knowledge from a small data set, which turns out to be just what you need for data synthesis. So I didn't get into the data privacy business. We just happened to build a really good solution that's really easy to use. So how can you not proliferate something that helps data privacy? That's my data, my kids' data. So that was one, and then I can't even remember question number two. What was
question number two is, so if you know, if policymakers need to see something to actually believe it, so what are either things you're doing or what are things that we could do as demonstration projects to sort of capture the imagination of staffers, members in government, and things like that?
Well, so, you know, I just got off a call with a couple ex-secretaries of defense, and there's a lot of interest in the sort of human services, defense, and sort of protection side of the government. Imagine the next Katrina or the next COVID. So what could we have done beforehand to have those be less impactful and that our country could be more resilient? And there's a lot of interest actually in synthetic data lakes, because the Johnsons and Johnsons, well, you know, MasterCards, any of the companies that wouldn't mind sharing their data in an emergency don't want to share it all the time. And how do you manage that, which is sort of what Krista's tackling. Imagine they can just put their synthetic data in and say, this may not be, for example, all of the Samsung IoT information from my great state of North Carolina for everyone. That would be super private information. But if it was a synthesized version of that, And then when we have a problem, whether it's a COVID or a hurricane or whatever, that would be a wealth of information to feed to first responders or DHS. And so I think there's a lot of interest. If we can't solve the problem the way we'd want to, then how do we solve it? And then synthetic data is, I've been talking to senators about it, which is just where it needs to be. So I'm
excellent. Well, and on that note, I mean, if you're open to it later, we have a geotech commission that does have Senator Mark Warner from Virginia, Senator Rob Portman from Ohio, and we're producing recommendations for them. So if you can spare just a little bit, we'd love to actually have your recommendations feed in that as well.
It's my full-time job. I'm delighted to. No problem.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. So thank you for that, Mike. And now we'd actually like to welcome a longtime friend of the Geotech Center, going back even before the Geotech Center was a Geotech Center, Jeff Frazier, who is also a senior fellow. He's been instrumental in actually pulling together this panel, and he actually has the first question. So over to you, Jeff, with the first sort of question for the panelists here today.
Well, they've already covered all the terrific topics. Thank you, David. You put together really a terrific group of experienced opinion leaders on the topic. It's a growing certainly an important topic. A couple things. If my question is more directed to Dr. Capps. Years ago, my former boss, I worked for the chairman at Cisco, and he used to say, watch the leaders in a category move to other categories and understand why they do that. And so if you're between the age of 6 and 26 in the world, you're familiar with Epic Games or have an affinity for it, which as parents, we know it as Fortnite. And so the question with the follow-up question was, having successfully led a category in the industry and gaming, what did you see or what did you not see in the role of data and advanced AI that made you want to lead a new category? And then the second part of that is, how do you see the commercial side of synthetic data forming? Because I think it's going to be a giant impact to all of our industries. And I'd just like to see what you're seeing early.
Ooh, okay. Thanks for the question, Jeff. So I would say on the what do I see happening in the marketplace, there's definitely leaders that have, let's just say, the discretionary budget to put into an effort like this to test because they see the value of it. I think that market's going to explode very quickly when the stakes come. Right now, it's still carrots. It's still forward-thinking organizations like a UBS or MasterCard, whoever, that are doing this kind of work internally because they see the benefits, and a few healthcare organizations and the like that see the benefits, governments. But boy, is that going to change really fast because almost every healthcare org I talk to uses really primitive masking technology, literally just censoring with a black pen what they're doing. And then you asked about the shift. I'd say one of the things that I saw in video games that became really troubling to me is the shift went from, I'll put it in movie terms because everybody here watches movies. The shift went from 2-hour really good movies to TikTok and YouTube. And so what happened was the job was to monetize psychological warfare. It's absolutely about reciprocity techniques to David gives Krista a gift in the game because we help him to do so. And then she feels like she owes him one, so she can't quit. And now we've created this cycle of we're individualizing the sale per person. For you, Jeff, it's 20 cents. And for Jacqueline, it's 15 cents or 30 cents, depending on the day and your mood. And we're watching all that. It really presaged some of Cambridge Analytica and what you can do with data and people. And that's not a really fun business for entertainment, right? I mean, that's become the game of video games. And I was delighted to get away from that and work on something a little bit more meaty, let's say. So there you go.
Well, thank you for your leadership, Mike. Really appreciate it. And thank you, Jeff, as well, for everything you're doing to help bring together thinking about how data and tech is changing the world and changing societies. I'm actually going to go to some of the additional questions we've gotten so far. We've got about 3 open ones. We've got some other ones we may circle back to. This one I actually want to go to Stephen on, which actually asks the question from a data science perspective. How do you ensure that the data set is representative of the original data set, recognizing it as a synthetic one?
Yeah, actually, I think Mike is going to have a much better answer on that. So I'll push it over to him. I've heard his answer to this, and I know it's better. So
all right, sounds good. Thank you, Stephen. Over to you, Mike. Then.
I'm getting a lot of airtime here. I was literally typing in the background to answer that question. So I mean, I think representative is per purpose, right? It's a domain-specific question. If what you're trying to say is, does it actually include all the mathematics of the original set. Most people care more about analyzing closeness of the synthetic set to the original set to make sure you haven't crossed a boundary and you've actually put Dr. David Dre in your new set and anybody can find that. And so, for example, if you're using this to train a neural net, here's an example. We did a system for missile targeting where they wanted to use missile trajectories to train a new missile AI. Well, you would train it with both the original set and the new set and see how well they performed. Was it useful enough? Because it was for a specific problem. And so that's the only measure of quality that mattered. And then we made sure the synthetic data was representative and not similar. And then you could train that AI and have no concerns this scary, yucky black box AI in the new system could ever leak the original classified data. But there's not a lot of publications in that space. It's relatively new. So I would just say make sure it solves the problem you're trying to solve as opposed to there being a true answer.
Very well said.
If maybe I could build on that just a little bit. So, one of the things that we've seen, I would say, over the last decade or so with organizations adopting AI is one, is it fit for purpose, right? Do you actually need it here, or are you just sprinkling it on because you like to sprinkle sprinkles everywhere and you're doing it for that reason? And then the second one is really, what along the lines of what Mike was saying is this notion, is it better than what, right? And this comes back to AI, right? If we have a system that we know is it's about 40 to 60% accurate, without artificial intelligence. And now we're going to add AI in and we can juice that to say 70% accurate. It's still not very good, but it's better, much better maybe than what we had before. And so the question becomes in synthetic data, the same thing. Does it achieve the objective that you're doing, and how closely does it achieve that objective? And in many cases, we're willing to sacrifice a little sliver of accuracy for the privacy preserving that it gives us, right? For the ability to transact data with other parties and that kind of thing. And so, generally what we see is that there is a decline in accuracy. That's not always the case, but we see a decline. Is that decline a couple percent? Is that decline 20%? And these are case-by-case scenarios based upon what that data set looks like. But is it sufficient to do a good job on what we're trying to do, and how do you measure that is really kind of that key metric. And then we can start diving into, features of that synthetic data set. Does it, guarantee protection of classes? Does it give you a furtherance toward the normative values of justice you're trying to optimize for? How does it perform under different constraints? And then that's really kind of what we want to look at for performance metrics as well as we kind of move further in this field. But there's so much opportunity for research.
Very well said, Stephen. And if I could ask you a real quick rejoinder that I'm also going to ask Jacqueline, and then I'm going to go to Krista and Stuart with questions about AI and bias and fairness with AI. But for you, Stephen, and for Jacqueline, questions come up about the possibility of people being paid for their use of data and how it might relate to synthetic data. Are there some examples out there? So I want to go to you first, Stephen, and then Jacqueline, I'd be interested in your thoughts about how this might relate to the African continent and how this might actually be a possibility to be considered there too. So first, over to you, Stephen.
Thanks. Yeah, I answered this a little bit in text response. I think it's a great question because one of the things that we've looked at in the past is kind of, data trusts for this purpose, right? If I'm a data producer, I might want to disclose that data to a data trust so that others can use it, right? Maybe I own 10 million IoT devices in the field, and those could provide insights for a range of industries. How do I actually put that somewhere where those industries could benefit from that? Well, I might be able to put that into a data trust or some type of an exchange. But then on the micro scale, right, on the individual contributions, I think we saw, when Microsoft bought LinkedIn, it was something, the value, I want to say per record was something like $6, right? So we've actually been able to put a value on a single record in a very large data set. What does that look like, right? Those individuals did not get paid out some, restitution or remuneration for their data being part of that, but certainly their data added to the value of that data set. And so that is a very hard question. And I think that the notion of synthetic data, because synthetic data would not exist without that original data to inform it, it's just, it adds an obfuscation layer to an already very difficult problem. And so, I don't have the answer. I think that.
But I think you did a very good exploring the space. And so I give you kudos for that, Stephen. So Jacqueline, you had been talking about, the ideas of financial inclusion, financial uplift, but I'd be interested in your thoughts about how this might apply from what you're seeing in the region as well, please.
I think it would be great, first of all, if there were the potential for people to get paid for their data. Unfortunately, at the moment, I don't think we're there yet. What we are seeing is, for instance, as you mentioned, financial inclusion, where people who typically were not included, did not have access to a bank account or any form of financial services, are now able to, for instance, use their phone records to determine, how bankable they'll really be or how creditworthy they'll be, and those credit scores are then used later on to allow them to access financial services. And so I do think going above and beyond that, the next level, if financial services institutions were actually able to then use that data and pay for it, I think that that would be great. Now, from an organizational perspective, I just think right now, unfortunately, it is too messy. And I don't think any of the bigger institutions right now, honestly, would want to, deal with it. Having said that, what we are seeing is in countries like Rwanda, which are really kind of inviting tech investment in and are saying, if you investor X come to the country, we are considering ourselves, can we say, a policy hub. We will work with you to create a necessary policy environment. And so in such a situation, I could see Rwanda saying, okay, besides data use, what else do we need? Consent for portability, payment and the like, the right to delete it whenever you need to, and also pay. So I think that could be an interesting case in a country like Rwanda that's really trying to think forward. But otherwise, I think it is a good challenge and a good challenge to the private sector here on the continent to really figure out if there is a way of paying X amount for data use. Because at the moment, unfortunately, a lot of people whose data is being collected is either being collected without their consent, and if their consent is gotten, a lot of it is then used and people don't know what their data is being used for. And there's no way of really holding companies responsible.
Very well said, and I appreciate that, Jacqueline. And we can look to the future. Maybe we need to start doing a demonstration project to help sort of overcome that bystander effect where everybody thinks it's useful, but like you said, we have to galvanize people. So Stuart, I'd like to go to you, and then to Krista. A question about concerns about data bias or there being we actually have a question from Pat who's actually asking about various biases in terms of either race, gender, ethnicity, or age in the data set that we should be aware of here. And so I'd be interested first, Stuart, in your thoughts about what are you seeing in terms of either concerns there? Are legislatures starting to show concerns as well to make sure the data sets are representative? I'd be interested in your thoughts, Stuart, in terms of what you're seeing in trends in that space.
Sure. So David, there have been very interesting developments, particularly in the area of facial recognition. And obviously during the past year or so, with some of the situations we've had around the country, we've had more police forces and law enforcement now involved in thinking about or purchasing facial recognition systems. And we've seen some of the data which shows that in terms of being able to identify or misidentify based on racial categories, for example, it tends to be about a 30% error rate. So obviously that's a major policy concern for many cities in particular. In California, for example, both San Francisco and Oakland have banned the use of facial recognition by law enforcement. And in Massachusetts, Boston has as well. In addition to a number of smaller cities, Massachusetts may become the first state in the country to essentially prohibit facial recognition by law enforcement. And then in New York City, for example, we had some proposals last year dealing with private landlords, whether or not they could use facial recognition in terms of swapping out their existing key systems for a facial recognition system. There was a proposal that in fact they would not be able to do that. They would have to stay with a manual key system. So I think there's going to be a lot of activity in this area, and we see the data showing us that although the systems are improving, when you have a 30% error rate, it certainly shows that there are real issues here. And obviously that also creates the great window potentially for synthetic data, which can improve that error rate.
Very well said, and I appreciate it, Stuart. And I think that's a good. It's a good overview of both the space we're in and then the solutions that synthetic data can do to try and overcome some of those challenges. And that's a good setup for Krista. So, Krista, I was going to go to you because there was a question that was similar to the question about AI bias, but we also just got one from longtime friend of the Geotech Center, who you know well too, Divya. Divya was actually asking a question about India and their biometric system. But I know, for example, you've been very instrumental in thinking about identity management in the context of Canada, and how we can make sure that it's done in such a way that is protected, that we're not revealing too much data. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts about what can we learn from Canada that might inform India or other places in the world as well.
Absolutely. So there's one thing that we've been talking about here that I find interesting is we're saying my data. And that's one of the things I think we have to challenge to start with is it my data or is it data about me? And so part of the context that we're looking at is it's data about me. And if we take, because it's very difficult to prove what is purely my data. So if we start talking about data about me, then that starts to fit within a framework conversation of what are the privacy rules we want around it? How do we want to manage it? What are some of the governance rules that we want to think about? In Canada, we've created something called the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. And that's been a collaboration between the government and the private sector coming together to create a framework based on privacy by design that says interoperability is the key component here. We are not trying to find a single solution that is going to work in all jurisdictions and across all platforms. What we do want to find is a common framework that we can all agree to that will allow interoperability, within Canada, but I mean, it's probably the nature of Canada being bilingual and being just north of the US, we tend to be international by perspective. So we look and say, how does this work not just within our federation, but also on an international basis? So the standards and frameworks that we've been looking at has been with that lens of interoperability. And considering, I think probably our Indigenous population has had an influence on this, is looking at it not just at an individual level, but looking at a community level. And I know, David, you had Dr. Tahu Kukatai on a while ago talking about Indigenous data principles and how things like sharing medical information for the Maori in New Zealand is not a personal, it's not about my data. That is actually perceived to be data of the community. So then what right do I as an individual have to share that? Those are some of the things that we've been trying to build into these considerations. And those are big questions. I don't think we're going to answer them right now, but to Divya and to others who are thinking about these questions, we need to think about it less as my data from an individualistic perspective and think more about data about me within a broader context, and then think about how do we create those interoperable systems, because we're not going to find the single magic bullet and get everybody to agree to that. It's just not going to happen.
Very well said. And I also want to give a shout out for the data salon that you did, Krista, with us. We'll definitely make sure we include it in the links from this episode because it was a very worthwhile watch. And what I like about what you're sharing is it is about thinking about interoperability, recognizing there is not going to be one solution that fits them all. And I also liked how you elevated thinking about the Indigenous data communities approach. I believe they talk about their CARE standards, in which the C stands for collectiveness, and that we need to recognize that it is data about me, but it's part of a larger whole, especially when you start thinking about family data or DNA data. It's really about people beyond just ourselves. So colleagues, we are now at the lightning round, and the lightning round is the last 10 minutes where I go to each of you and I ask you each for your 2 to 3 tweet length answers as to what you would recommend for either the president, the G20, the head of the United Nations, CEOs. This is your chance to actually make your pitch as to what we do. And I'm going to go first to Mike, and we're going to go in reverse order of how we started. So I'm going to go first to Mike and ask, what would be your 2 to 3 tweet links recommendations for different leaders in either the public or private sector based on what we've talked about today and the potential for synthetic data to be a huge uplift in people's lives?
Got it. So I'd say synthetic data techniques are available right now. You can buy them. There's 10 companies selling them. So it's not distant future. And I would say be wary of the technology that we all know doesn't work. Black box shouldn't be used where it shouldn't be used. Masking shouldn't be used where it shouldn't be used. And I think we all know that, and trying to get away with it's maybe not the best plan.
Very well said and very eloquent. Clearly, you have briefed leaders of the world before. We appreciate it, Mike, and we appreciate your insights. Look forward to having a deeper conversation with you about projects we can do together. That now is a good setup. Now we're going to go to Jacqueline. So what are your 2 to 3 tweet length recommendations for the leaders of the world as well?
Okay, mine are pretty simple. As countries, especially across emerging markets, continue to think about data, governments definitely need to factor in consumer protection and ethics considerations. As much as we think about people in their human form, I think we need to think about people in their data form as well, and not just put kind of numbers and algorithms. They're people at the end of the day.
Well
I
said.
think the other part is technology is changing fast. Regulators are chasing innovators, but I do think that there is a good opportunity now for regulators to work with innovators to make sure we get the law right and not have the law lag behind innovation. I think the last one is really kind of collaboration. I think this is a perfect opportunity as we all figure it out around the world to work together to figure it out. Whether it's in healthcare, financial services, COVID has taught us that we're all together in this fight. So I think there's also, the opportunity now with synthetic data to work together.
Very well said. We all stand together. And I wish we had more lawyers like you, Jacqueline, in your mindset, because I think with that, we can take on any challenge in the world. So thank you. Krista, your chance for your 2 to 3 tweet link recommendations to world leaders.
So a strong second to Jacqueline and the focus on ethics, just core to this entire conversation. Also design for diversity. A big problem with AI generated samples before this conversation has been that they've been drawing off of non-diverse groups. So that design for diversity is going to be key. And really, let's start looking at data trust. What gets me excited about synthetic data is that link into data trust. If we can start to know that the core data is valid and has been well thought out, and that the people who are associated to that have been informed about how that data is being brought in, and then we create the synthetic data out of that, the value and the insight into that is just going to be that much richer. So for me, it's those two go together, and that's where we'll get a lot of the richness.
Excellent. And thank you for that, Krista. And I know you are a person that is always focused on impact and delivering results. So I am hopeful that we can, in this space, find a way that actually can be a showcase, both to have immediate impact, sort of the examples you talked about improving the lives of children and actually research there, but also be a showcase to the rest of the world as to what's possible. So thank you for that, Krista. So Stuart, your thoughts about 2 to 3 tweet links recommendations for world leaders.
So let's return to the carrot aspect that I talked about earlier. I think one thing that would be important would be to develop some practical carrots. This would be both in the United States and obviously countries around the world, which are in the process of devising their own legislation in this area. What are a few of these? One might be safe harbors. So if you had synthetic data, that would essentially give you a safe harbor from enforcement or from the provisions of the legislation. Another would be antitrust exemption, which would allow companies in the same field to essentially get together and innovate, come up with solutions where antitrust law might currently prevent them from doing so. Also tax credits. You can come up with some focused tax credits for R&D in this synthetic data area. And then another area of focus would be in the international trade field. So there are a number of trade agreements, including most recently the USMCA, which is the successor to NAFTA. And within that, there are provisions now which require Mexico, Canada, and the United States to have ongoing discussions about digital privacy. So clearly, as part of those ongoing discussions, which are required by the treaty, I think synthetic data should be put into that mix.
Wow, very well said. And I think you underscored that, it is thinking about how we can actually do the carrot model and then how we can actually use the existing treaty to actually work together with our colleagues in Canada. Maybe we should do a future Geotech Hour if you're open to it with our colleagues in Mexico as well to actually have that conversation and maybe be the change that we want to have happen. But I really appreciate that, Stuart. Those were great recommendations. And so now, Stephen, you have the task of bringing it home for us. What are your 2 to 3 tweet links recommendations as we close? Oh, and you may be muted.
Yes, we can build on a couple of the things some of these other panelists have said as well. I think top of my mind is really focusing on the values and principles that we want to protect and promote, not the individual technologies that we're trying to push. The technologies will follow the policy if we can really hold that higher moral high ground. When we focus on human rights and value privacy above commerce, we can provide equity and inclusion in ways that we really haven't been able to realize before, and have really been in our ethos. And in all of this, we need to include options for recourse or guarantees for recourse to those who are impacted by AIs, whether they realize it or not. Maybe more specific for regulators, we should look at ways to limit liability for organizations as a carrot for continually improving disclosures in this space as well. So, we want to be able to hold the powerful accountable. We want to be able to look at those power dynamics, and we want to level that playing field a little bit more.
Extremely well said. And I like the 3 in particularly emphasizing making sure we have the moral high ground. We think about equity and inclusion and what can be done there. And like you said, holding the powerful accountable and also trying to figure out ways to actually make it a carrot model to move forward. So I thank you for that, Stephen. I thank you, Stuart, Krista, Jacqueline, Mike. This has been a really engaging conversation. I thanks for everything that you're doing as positive change agents and to the questions from our audience. And as we like to remind everyone at the close of every Geotech Hour, we hope you will be bold, be brave, and be benevolent for the future ahead. I'll see you next time.